What we'd like to do now is move on. We're going to have a presentation of a white paper that was recently released yesterday, primarily by the Cuba Study Group in collaboration with the America Society and Council of the Americas and other groups such as Acción International. So I'd like to introduce Sean McKean, who's actually one of our fellow classmates here at Columbia, and also Matthew Ajo of the America Society and Council of the Americas, who are just going to give us a brief presentation on the white paper. So,
all right. Thank you. It's actually somewhat providential that we had the opportunity to speak today, because literally the white paper was released yesterday. We had a virtual press conference that was very successful, and so we're very grateful to Pepe and Lucia for giving us this opportunity. It's actually the first time that I sat down and talked with Pepe was at the beginning of the year this year, and it's amazing how it's come to now a 48-page white paper that provides very comprehensive recommendations and findings that we'd love to share with you. And I'll give you a little bit of background on the process, as well as some of the recommendations that we have for international sectors. And Matthew will then talk about some of the policy recommendations that we have. To give you a little background on the process overall, in January we had a summit of about 50 experts from the microfinance industry, from small business education, and from economic development come together here in New York City to discuss small business in Cuba. A simple concept, but one that for most of us is foreign, because as we know, pretty much everything in Cuba is run by state enterprises. And we really had the goal of bringing together these experts to identify, number one, what are the challenges to doing microfinance in Cuba? What are the challenges that small business owners are going to confront? As well as think about cases from other countries that might be relevant to the Cuba context, so that we could begin to formulate some recommendations that would really inform the Cuban government's policies moving forward. Today, given that there have been some very substantial reforms that the Cuba government has announced, and what we've seen, a very devastated economy in Cuba, we really do believe that it's more important than ever for us as supporters to provide this kind of support. As you'll see in some of the things that we discuss, the white paper looks to analyze the way that small business and different microeconomic reforms can work to support Cuba's economic recovery. And we also really want to look at how private organizations, as well as social organizations, can look to support the efforts of small business owners on the island. In just a few days, there's a very important event that's going to be taking place in Cuba. All of Cuba's leaders will be convening for the 6th Congress of the Communist Party to review and approve a set of economic measures to jumpstart the economy. This is perhaps going to contain some of the most significant economic reforms that we've seen in the 50 years since the revolution. And I think we really strongly believe, and probably most of the leaders believe, that Cuba's future is really riding on this event. What's been interesting is over the course of the last couple months, there have been some substantial developments even leading up to this Congress. The first is that the government has allowed for 178 different types of private licenses for Cuban citizens to be able to start their own business. This is a landmark reform in the sense that prior to that, there were really only 3 or 4 areas within tourism that people could have a small business, and now they've widened the opportunity. In line with that, as of March 11th, there have been over 171,000 of these licenses issued. So there is beginning to be demand, and you can see that Cubans really do want to have their own businesses, their own enterprises, which to us is a sign that the entrepreneur in Cuba really is going to have an essential role in some of the reforms that we're going to see coming out of this Congress. And the aim of the white paper was to bring light to that fact, but also, especially in a context like this, to remove the discussion from, hey, this is just a Cuba issue, or this is just a Cuban-American issue, or this is just a Latin American issue, but really that this is about microfinance in general and small business in general. And so I think having this opportunity among people that are experts and they're thinking about microfinance is a tremendous one. A couple of things that we believe that even the Cuban leaders are thinking about with relation to small and micro enterprises is that they can help the current economic crisis that's going on in a couple different ways. The first is just in reducing government expenditures. So what was announced earlier last year was that they're going to lay off anywhere between 500,000 and 1 million state workers from the government's payrolls because the government just cannot support to pay those people anymore. And so the idea was to promote private enterprise so that these people could make a living but reduce the payments that the government has and reduce the deficit that the government has. And so by promoting small business, they'll be able to set up a system of taxation as well as remove these people from their payroll so that they can reduce the expenditures that the government has in terms of labor. The second is that we strongly believe it'll help to increase worker productivity. The Cuban leaders, even in the press, and many of the Cuban economists that are Cuban, that are living on the island, that are at the University of Havana, have cited that incentive-based wages really will boost productivity, and that eliminating the salary caps that are there and terminating redundant workers in government will have this effect. It really will increase worker productivity. And to us, here in the U.S., that sounds so elementary. But in Cuba, that's a very radical statement and one that we think has much potential. The third impact that it could have is to raise the wages that people make. So right now, on average, a Cuban brings home about $24 a month. And so by having this opportunity to run their own enterprise, they clearly can expand much more beyond that with the right regulatory framework in place. The fourth is that it will contribute to growing domestic savings. And so we see the opportunity for surplus earnings in some of these small and micro enterprises to increase the domestic savings and be a new source of capital for investment. Given all these factors, it's interesting because it's clear that the Cuban leaders understand this. It's very clear that these elements could have a substantial impact. But what's not clear is what's going to come out of the party Congress coming up. And so our hope is that many of the reforms that will be announced will remove some of the obstacles that are standing in the way in Cuba, ones that some of us may be aware of, but I'll walk us through a few of those. The first is a very basic one that we're all here for, and that's simply access to capital. Just last week, the Cuban government announced that state banks would begin issuing loans to small and micro enterprises. And this was very significant because prior to that just had not taken place. Never in the 50 years of the revolution had there been loans issued by state banks.
To individuals.
Exactly, to individuals. Good point. However, the challenge is that there is a substantial lack of liquidity, and there's a stagnant banking sector in Cuba. And so there has to be a way that this process can be sped up and that more capital can be infused into the economy. Even many of Cuba's top economists have recognized the important role that microlending could play in Cuba's development, but they really think it's important to bring in nonprofit institutions and other organizations that could allow for this type of investment to come in from foreign sources rather than just from the state itself. The second obstacle is that they need to have market-driven wholesale markets. So as it stands right now, there's no way for any of these people that start up their own private business in any of these 178 categories that exist to be able to access goods to build their inventory because it all costs the same as it would in a regular market. And often they have to go into the black market to purchase many of the things that go into their inventory. A third issue is just the general regulatory environment that exists in Cuba. Many of these things are things that we're aware of. High taxes on these private entrepreneurs, no property rights, really no sense of an independent judiciary so that they can mediate these types of disputes that might come up. And so we think it's important for Cuba to learn from examples such as Vietnam or even China in the way that they've been able to implement some substantive reforms to address these types of regulatory issues. A fourth, which is one that was even mentioned in some of the panels earlier as something that's essential to effective microlending, is a lack of training. So we know that in Cuba, the level of education is extraordinary. Literacy rates are, in fact, even higher than here in the U.S. But with that said, new entrepreneurs still lack basic business skills. You can't take accounting courses. The financial literacy is low, marketing skills, all these things that we take for granted. There really is no access to that in Cuba, and that's something that will have to be taken into account. And the fifth thing is weak domestic demand. So as long as people are still making $24 a month, it doesn't allow for very much disposable income for people to go and purchase from these entrepreneurs. And so there has to be a way to increase levels of demand, or perhaps even open up ways for these entrepreneurs to export, so that you can increase the amount of demand that's there. Again, I just think that with the average salary being so low, this demand issue has to be addressed. It's interesting when I go back there and I speak with my family that's there. One of the lines you always hear is, "We pretend to work and the government pretends to pay us." And until that day ends, this opportunity is limited for people that will be starting their own businesses. It is going to be super critical that many of these obstacles are addressed, and our hope with this white paper was to bring attention to that. I'm going to conclude with a couple recommendations that we offer to international players, whether they're private sector actors or social organizations, and how they can support these developments that are taking place on the island. The first is to address one of the obstacles that we discussed, which is delivering business training. And that could happen in several different ways. I think the first, there are great models that are done by groups such as Acción International that focus on sort of experience-based learning for adult business owners. And to initiate programs like that in Cuba would be a great jumpstart to the development of small business there. The second is to develop partnerships between the Cuban universities, who are doing such a tremendous job educating people, and international NGOs, so that this could even be integrated into elements of curriculum. A third opportunity for delivering this type of business training would relate to mentorship. Most of us are very familiar with Endeavor's model, the way they connect experienced entrepreneurs with budding entrepreneurs. And so to be able to do that, perhaps even with the Cuban American community, where there are so many successful entrepreneurs, would be a very effective model. And the final one, and one that I think we're particularly excited about, is developing an online entrepreneur community. Now, at this time, internet penetration in Cuba is very low. In fact, it's only about 10%. But we are seeing that growing. And we think that having a space where entrepreneurs can interact and share resources, information, would allow for another way for people to have this kind of connection and develop their training needs. The last thing I'd like to talk about in terms of recommendations relates to things that are somewhat still out of our control, but things that perhaps could happen in the medium term. During the next, we'd say 2 to 5 years, we expect there to be significant changes in the economic, fiscal, and regulatory policies that we see in Cuba, and perhaps also to U.S. sanctions, which Matthew will speak about shortly. But we think that if those types of changes take place, it could make more elaborate programs a possibility. What kinds of things are we talking about? Well, one would be targeted remittance to entrepreneur programs. So what's interesting about the Cuban economy is at this time, remittances are essentially the second largest source of money, the second largest industry in Cuba behind tourism. Over $1 billion is sent there every year. And recent U.S. policy allows for any U.S. citizen to send about $2,000 every year per recipient to the island. And so that's a source of capital that could be targeted to entrepreneurs, and it could be essential to the development of these small businesses if targeted in the correct way. A second medium-term initiative would be the development of a microfinance fund. And the Cuba Study Group has already committed to raising a fund that would be as large as $50 million as sort of a stage one venture for this effort. Clearly, there are some incredible lessons that have been learned throughout the world in terms of microenterprise, but given some of the unique challenges that are going to take place there in Cuba, having this type of a stage one venture would be essential. And the people that want to invest in this are there, given the demand that's in the Cuban American community and throughout the world to help people in Cuba. The last thing that we would look at is something from a medium-term perspective that could be a very effective initiative would be an enterprise fund. And these were seen many times after the fall of the Berlin Wall in Europe, and we think a model similar to that would be approved by Congress that would assist with the development of private enterprise, but not private enterprise just in the sense of giving small loans, but perhaps for larger businesses that could be scaled. This is something that we'll have to look at over time, but one that we do feel is a realistic initiative that could be taken on. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Matthew Aho to discuss how this relates to United States policy.
Thank you. So in addition to this business paradise that Sean just described in Cuba with all the regulatory issues, you probably noticed that we have a trade embargo against Cuba. This is a situation that's been going on since the 60s. It hasn't changed, and it's not likely to change anytime soon in a comprehensive sense. This has been a debate about the embargo. There are groups on one side advocating that we have to take a hard line against Castro. Groups on the other side that are saying, well, we should lift the embargo. This is ridiculous. It hasn't worked. It's been 50 years now. There are groups on the travel prohibitions. All U.S. People can't travel to Cuba. So there are groups that say, we have to lift the restrictions. Groups that say we can't. And what happens is that, over the course of the last few decades, people have come to think that there are only two ways to think about the embargo. There are only two ways to think about the travel restrictions. But in reality, if you take a hard look, you realize that the embargo is only an incredibly complex, interweaving series of laws, presidential directives, regulations, and I have a lot of friends in Washington who are lawyers who are perfectly happy with the situation because they're the only ones who understand it and they give advice to companies who are interested in doing things in Cuba. But it's impractical from a policy perspective for the United States to have this, this mammoth legal complex embargo and still try to achieve certain foreign policy objectives. For example, there are certain things we want. In Egypt, in the Middle East, we're seeing all these Facebook revolutions, Twitter, people's uprisings. This isn't happening in Cuba. One of the reasons is because people don't have access to those tools there. So, why would the U.S. government want its own restrictions to prevent people in Cuba from accessing these tools? And the answer is that we don't. And so in 2009, President Obama released new regulations that essentially, they were designed to expand communications links between the U.S. and Cuba. Now, I'll bring how this is relevant to the discussion of microfinance in a minute. But the point is that the White House recognized that there were problems with its policy and recognized that there were specific steps that it could take. Not lifting the embargo, that would require an act of Congress. But there were specific steps that the president could take under executive authority to expand the information, the flow of information to the Cuban people. And then, as Sean was saying, in January of this year, we saw the second series of policy changes coming from the White House. And these were interesting because, most of the time, every president since Carter basically lifted all travel restrictions, including Reagan, Clinton, and Bush Sr. Every president has taken the opportunity to change elements of the embargo through executive licensing authority. Now, this has been usually just in travel. Cuban Americans can travel freely to Cuba. They can get on a plane every week if they want and fly to Cuba and come back. They can send almost unlimited remittances to their family members. These are the types of things that the president can do and can exercise authority without consulting Congress. He issues an order. It goes to the Treasury Department. There's an office at the Treasury Department that's in charge for enforcing sanctions. And then, it's there. I mean, you can do it. And so in January, on the 28th, the White House released some new regulations. And for the first time in history, a part of those regulations, the part that refers to remittances from ordinary U.S. citizens to people that they don't perhaps even know in Cuba, was to promote private economic activity on the island. And that's a quote out of the White House. And in reading that, I mean, I work on the Cuba policy stuff. I've been doing it for a while. It can be mundane, but in reading that, I sort of took note, and I said, well, gee, it looks like somebody, at the White House in the State Department is taking a good look at what's happening in Cuba and saying, okay, well, how is the U.S. government going to respond to this? What's the response? We've been advocating for Cuba to move towards a market economy for 50 years, and it hasn't done it. Now it appears to be doing so, and we need to make sure that we, that our own laws, our own sanctions, kind of get out of the way of this process, and that's what's going on. So let me just walk you through what became possible on January 28th. The first is a general license for any U.S. person to send remittances of up to $500. We talked about that one. But the term general license is important. It's an important distinction. General license means you don't have to apply for a license. You don't need to fill out an application. You don't need to go to the Treasury Department. It means that if you're a U.S. citizen, you can just do it. As a student, or the students that are here, as of the 28th of January, if Columbia University issues you a letter and says you're going to Cuba to do a study on microenterprise or something, you can get on a plane and go to Cuba. You don't need to go to the Treasury Department. So that's general. Specific would mean that Columbia has to go to the Treasury Department, apply for a license, and then it can give its students authorization to go to Cuba. But moving on, it created a general license covering remittances to religious organizations in Cuba in support of religious activities. I'll get to why it's important, the terminology, in a minute, but this is also new and unlimited. It means that, if you're a church group here in the U.S. and you decide that you're going to have a fundraiser for, a church group in Cuba, you can do it and you can send the money and you don't have to even tell the U.S. government that you're doing it. And then for U.S. educational and religious institutions, this is a big one, another first. Apparently, as of the 28th of January, if Columbia University wants to have an exchange program with the University of Havana, they can set it up. They can put staff in Havana, including part-time staff, and they can open up a bank account in a Cuban bank to basically fund the activities or the programs that they have. This is a first. So that's another one. It created a specific license category, meaning you would have to apply, but you can now apply for a license to be able to send remittances, and this would be pretty much unlimited, to independent non-governmental entities inside Cuba to support private business. So you can go and you can apply, and if this is all new stuff. And then lastly, and this is important, and I was telling Sean about it earlier, you can apply for a license now. For example, Columbia could, or Columbia Business School could, apply for a license to have the next Microlumbia in Havana to discuss microfinance there with counterparts at the University of Havana. They've created this category for workshops and for all sorts of different collaborative efforts. So those are what I think are most relevant probably to the question of microenterprise. And in terms of microfinance, I think clearly remittances is going to be a big source, but there are other questions. Okay, so there are these authorizations. But let's say we want to pool a bunch of money. Let's say that I'm Cuban and I have a family in Cuba, and I want to raise a bunch of money for my rich friends to be able to fund activities there. I'll get to it. All right, so I'm going to move very quickly along. I do want to, but I'll go quick. Obviously, the president could do more. There are other steps that can be taken. Bump up remittance limitations. Authorize NGOs to be able to travel to Cuba. Establish licenses to actually provide services to entrepreneurs. So let's say that I'm a software developer in Cuba, and I need a distributor in the United States. He could authorize specific exports like software, and he could authorize a company in the U.S. to distribute that. There are other steps. We can talk about them. I do want to open up for questions, but like Sean was saying, the reason we wanted to be here and present this is because I think that there are a lot of people who have watched the mistakes happen in terms of the development of microenterprise and microfinance all over the world. This is happening right now in Cuba. I mean, this is a process that's ongoing. The Cubans are, in many cases, just running blind. They don't have the level of contact with experts from across a wide range of fields that would be required, I think, to expect to do these reforms successfully. And we're going to see. But it's exciting to take a look at what's going on. And if there's time for questions, we'll do it.
Okay, we're running a little behind, but we can do one question. Barbara, go ahead.
Yeah.
Because you were saying that you can send money to independent, non-governmental entities that support enterprise. It doesn't sound like there are that many right now. Are they being created, and can they be created from the outside? Do they have to come from the inside?
Good questions. I mean, a lot of this we're going to see. There aren't all that many, but I mean, this is a big public event, so I probably shouldn't talk about specifics. But there is one group. There's one group. There's one group in Cuba that that's affiliated with the Catholic Church there, and there have been some initial efforts to include in terms of like their outreach to the community and in terms of local activities, sort of programs to help entrepreneurs with very low levels of funding. $50, $100, things like that, things to get started. There are some groups. There are groups that are obviously trying to do things under, in reflection to these changes. And I think it remains to be seen, but it seems like the intent of the U.S. government is to try to step out of the picture there and just sort of let these things develop.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. And I'm sorry we don't have more time for questions, but I encourage everybody to come up to Sean and Matt. That was fascinating.